I want to start with the observation that it seems possible to give metaphysical explanations for certain features of reality. To give a simple example, we think that the world has certain chemical features, and yet we think that the world also has more fundamental physical features that are responsible for the chemical features that we find. And it seems possible to explain why the world has its chemical features in terms of its physical features. So my starting point is the idea that metaphysical explanation is possible. We can explain certain less fundamental features of reality in terms of certain more fundamental features of reality from which those less fundamental features derive, upon which they depend, which they are grounded upon. And what I want to pose as a question for us is the question of what must the world be like in order for metaphysical explanation to be possible? Good. So those of you who've read Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a series of books that I loved as a kid, might remember that Adams describes a society in which people build a great computer, the greatest computer, the second greatest computer in the history of the universe, Earth being the greatest computer. The second greatest computer in the history of the universe, called deep thought. And deep thought is programmed to answer the greatest questions of life, the universe, and everything. And deep thought calculates and whirs and gurgles and computes for millions and millions of years until that fateful day when deep thought declares, I've got it. I've got the answer. And of course, the answer is 42. And people are outraged, and they say, what's going on? We've invested all these millions of years and countless money. This is clearly a mistake. And deep thought replies, I've checked the answer very carefully, and it is definitely not a mistake. I think the problem is that you never knew what the question was. So I love that anecdote, and I think that there's something about that anecdote that applies to metaphysical inquiry. Because metaphysical inquiry, one of the deepest inquiries that we face, one of the challenges sometimes is to say what the question is that we're asking. And so what I want to start off by talking about, and this is my section on ground, is a kind of contemporary rediscovery of a kind of Platonistic and Aristotelian conception of metaphysical inquiry, not as concerning what exists, but as concerned with the questions of what grounds what, how the less fundamental is related to the more fundamental. So here's Willard Van Orman Quine, the great American philosopher, whose influence in metaphysics over the last century is seminal. Before Quine, metaphysics was in disrepair and disrepute, largely considered meaningless, an inquiry not worth pursuing. And it was Quine who, I single-handedly would be too strong, but I think had the dominant influence in a revival of metaphysical inquiry. And what Quine had was, well, he had two things. He had a conception of what metaphysical questions were, and he coupled that with a methodology for answering those questions. Quine's conception of metaphysical inquiry is it concerned what exists, what there is. That's the title of his most famous essay. And Quine quipped that there is a simple answer to that, which is everything. But he added that there remains dispute over cases. And so he went on to consider some cases that where he thought the existence questions were particularly challenging and interesting. Questions such as whether meanings exist, whether numbers exist, and questions of that ilk. And so Quine really inaugurated a revival of metaphysical inquiry centered on the question of what exists, where questions such as do numbers exist were regarded as paradigmatic examples of good metaphysical questions. And I mentioned as well that Quine also had a methodology for pursuing metaphysical inquiry that he coupled with those kind of questions. His idea was we could go to our best theories. We could formalize them in a preferred logical system. For Quine, that was first-order quantificational logic. And we could see what our quantifiers would need to range over for the resulting theories to be true. Never mind the details, whether you were following those details or not. I won't be talking much about the methodology. What I want to focus on, rather, is the idea that the questions of metaphysics are about what there is. I think there's something puzzling about thinking of metaphysical inquiry along those lines. Let's just consider the example, one of those that Quine considered paradigmatic, as to whether numbers exist. I think it's very obvious that the answer to that question is yes. And you can see that the answer to the question must be yes just by asking yourself, is there a number between 5 and 7? That's easy. But if there's a number between 5 and 7, it follows by elementary logical operations that there's a number. Or ask yourself, are there prime numbers? Well, we all know that's, again, an obvious question. There are prime numbers. It follows by elementary logical operations, in this case, they're called adjective drop, that if there are, just as we can infer from the existence of red roses that there are roses, we can infer from the existence of prime numbers that there are numbers. Something's gone wrong. What had seemed like it was supposed to be a reflection of the deepest kinds of metaphysical questions turns out to have a trivial and superficial yes answer. And what's worse, just to connect back to Quine's methodology for a moment, part of Quine's methodology was that we need to look at the details of our best scientific understanding of the world in order to truly determine what's out there. But yet, the way that we seem to have come to a yes answer to the question of whether numbers exist involved no detour whatsoever through the details of quantum mechanics. I didn't need you to walk you on a tour of sophisticated physical theorizing. I just needed to remind you of something you learned when you were 5 or 6 years old, probably, or earlier. So we not only have found a question that I think has a superficial and uninteresting yes answer, but it's one whose answer required no knowledge whatsoever of our best scientific theorizing. So in light of the fact that metaphysical questions, as Quine and his followers conceived them, have seemed trivial, a number of philosophers, including Kit Fine, Gideon Rosen, Karen Bennett, and myself, have pursued a re-understanding of metaphysical questions that harkens back to Plato, and I'd say primarily to Aristotle, though Aristotle describes this, though he credits many of the ideas to Plato. So you can think of this as something that Aristotle extracted from Plato's thinking. And that's the idea that what metaphysical questions are about the order of fundamentality. They're about what grounds what. In fact, when Aristotle himself considers the question of number, he very briefly mentions the prospect of denying that numbers exist and dismisses it immediately. That's be a silly thing to say. And he says the real interesting question about numbers is not whether they exist, because of course they do. The interesting question about numbers is how they exist. How do they come into the world? And here we can distinguish a wealth of interesting, vital positions about the status of numbers in reality. On the one hand, we might have something that looks like a Platonistic conception of numbers, where numbers are just these fundamental, basic constituents of reality, perhaps alongside some other fundamental constituents, but they are among the fundamental constituents of reality. No further account can be given of how they came to being. They're there from the start, as it were. Not the start in time, but the start in the order of grounding, in the order of fundamentality. But we might also have a view that Aristotle himself sometimes seems to favor, where numbers are not fundamental entities, but they are to be abstracted from the goings-on in the concrete world around us. So numbers are these abstract entities. The number 2 is something that we can never touch or see or taste or bump into. It's some abstract creature. Aristotle had this idea that there's the goings-on in the concrete realm, and then these more abstract ideas are to be, well, abstracted from how things are around us. So we might think that there are, in the concrete world, pairs of things. And the number 2 is somehow an abstraction from all the pairs to be found in the world, or something along those lines. I'm just giving you a flavor of a different conception of the metaphysics of numbers that's based on a kind of grounding style approach to metaphysical inquiry. A third option, which harkens back at least to the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, is to think of numbers as mind-dependent. And to say that something is mind-dependent is not to deny that it exists. It's rather to say that its existence is dependent on minds, on our minds, and our minds exist. So for Kant, numbers are something like projections or reflections of a kind of conceptual structure that we impose upon a sort of some kind of pre-numeric reality. And these are all different stories, the Platonistic story, the Aristotelian story, the Kantian story. They're all different stories about why there are numbers. So, to illustrate another example of these explanatory issues in metaphysics, we might take issues in the metaphysics of mind. So I think one of the deepest and most difficult ongoing issues in philosophy is the status of conscious experience. On the one hand, it seems that conscious experience has to be generated by physical systems. We are physical organisms. We are bags of chemicals, mostly water. We evolved in various ways. We're physically generated in various ways. Our consciousness resides in our brain. If our brains are altered in various ways, our consciousness is thereby altered. So there's tremendous pressure to think that consciousness must somehow be a physical phenomenon. And yet it remains utterly obscure, mysterious, and elusive how consciousness could be a physical phenomenon. In other cases, such as, for instance, say, the case of heat, we have some understanding of how assemblages of particles, by having certain kinds of mean motions, could generate the phenomenon of heat. But it's utterly mysterious how some swarm of particles, or vibration series of strings, or smearing of physical fields over space-time, or however you want to think about the physics, it's utterly mysterious how that could give rise to a particular feeling. Pinch yourself. Feel a particular, no, really do it. Really. Come on, play along. You feel a particular pain, a little pain. What is it about the particular arrangements of your particles, or whatever you're made of, that makes it the case that you have that particular feeling, as opposed to a tickle, or any other sort of feeling that you might have? The connection between your physical state and the particular state of your consciousness remains elusive. But there's no serious question that we enjoy conscious experience. There can be no serious question that our minds exist and that consciousness is real. If there's anything that we are most directly acquainted with, it's our own consciousness. So when we come to issues in the metaphysics of mind, if we're thinking of these as existence questions, we will not understand the question. We will think that the only question about consciousness will be, does it exist? To which the answer is, yeah, obviously. The interesting question about consciousness, again, is not whether it exists, because it obviously does. It's how it exists. Should we think of consciousness akin to the way that Plato thought of number, as an additional fundamental ingredient of reality, in a tradition that harkens back to the great French philosopher René Descartes? Or should we think of consciousness in a way that harkens back at least to the great English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, as some manifestation of our material being and ultimately rooted in some way in our physical natures? So these are questions about how to explain the existence and the nature of consciousness. One other example, which I'll just mention because it's one that I've found particularly interesting. Here, of course, is the cosmos as a whole. And there's this great historical tradition in metaphysics, going back, well, at least to the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, and arguably back to Plato and his own teacher Parmenides, of thinking of the cosmos as a single fundamental integrated system, thinking of the whole as most fundamental. And on that perspective, of course, we wouldn't want to deny, we'd be crazy to deny that you and I each exist. We're not identical to each other. So in saying that the whole is fundamental, this holistic vision of the cosmos, in saying that, one doesn't want to deny that many things exist, like you and I. Rather, on this perspective, things like you and I are to be regarded ultimately as dependent fragments on one fundamental integrated whole. The alternative perspective, of course, is to say that the smallest parts are most fundamental. This is a view that may seem natural to many of you who are at least raised on a kind of image of physics as about little particles interacting with each other. So you may think that, again, that of course you exist and of course I exist, but that we are not, as it were, sliced out from the whole, but built up from a heap of little particles bonded together. So these issues about the metaphysical priority of whole and part are, again, not issues about what exists. We should all agree that there are particles, there are chemicals, there are persons, and there are larger physical systems, including ultimately the cosmos as a whole. The question here is, what's most fundamental? So that was a discussion of the notion of grounding, where grounding is the relation between the more fundamental entity, or entities, and the less fundamental entity from which they derive. And I was trying there to make the case for thinking of metaphysical inquiry as a pursuit into questions of what grounds what. And moreover, in thinking that it's possible to explain certain features of reality. Of course, there are going to be certain features of reality that are going to be fundamental. Maybe what's fundamental is just the physical state of the cosmos as a whole, or maybe what's most fundamental, it will include matters of consciousness or numbers or something like that. But there's going to be some fundamental basis from which everything else, you and I and tables and chairs and other derivative denizens of reality derive. So, having talked about grounding, I now want to turn to talk about the structure of explanation. And in section 2, I won't be talking about anything religious. I'll be talking rather about the idea that explanation has a threefold, tripartite, trinitarian structure. And I'll start off by talking about causal explanation. And I'll start off here because I think causal explanation is the best understood aspect of explanation. So when we see how causal explanation works, that'll give us some clues as to the structure of explanation generally that we might be able to cart over in thinking about metaphysical explanation. So in causal explanation, in metaphysical explanation, we were thinking about explaining, at least typically, the higher level features of systems at a time in terms of the lower level features of those systems at the same time. So for instance, I began by giving the example of the chemical state of the system at a time and the physical state of the system at the same time. So we were looking at a given time, but across, as it were, levels of reality. In causal explanation, typically at least, we're looking across time. We're looking at an earlier event that's causally generating some later event. So a paradigmatic example, what Hume called a sort of perfect instance of causation, at least as far as we conceive of it, is the case of the billiard ball. Here's the cue ball knocking into, maybe that's the 10 ball, you tell me, and driving the 10 ball into the corner pocket. So we have an event of the cue ball striking the 10 ball, and a second event of the 10 ball sinking into the corner pocket, and we have the claim that the first event causes the second event. And moreover, we have, and this is the crucial part now, we seem to be able to explain why that second event happened. Why did the 10 ball drop into the corner pocket, you might ask? And an excellent answer to that question would be because the cue ball struck it. We might want to go into more detail about the angle at which the cue ball struck it, the amount of force, etc., etc. But the cue ball's striking of the 10 ball seems to be part of the causal story and thereby part of the complete explanatory book that we might imagine we hold before us that details the fullest answer as to why the 10 ball sank into the corner pocket. With causal explanation, we have the cause and we have the effect, but there's something else that we need to mediate the transition from cause to effect. And that's something else we might call laws of nature. So it might be that we're operating in a Newtonian or quasi-Newtonian system where when balls bounce into each other, there's certain characteristic results. But that's only one way that nature could conceivably operate. We could at least conceive of a world whose laws of nature were entirely different. It takes deep empirical work to discover what our laws of nature actually happen to be. For all we could imagine, it could be that when the cue ball strikes the 10 ball will float into the air, grow wings and fly away, or burst into a rainbow of color, or any number of other things could be at least conceived of to follow upon the striking of the 10 ball by the cue ball. That the 10 ball will accelerate with a certain force that's determined by the masses of the balls involved is something that's only given to us when we have something like Newtonian mechanics or whatever the appropriate physical dynamics of the system happen to be. So, and this is a point that really goes back to Carl Hempel and Paul Oppenheim's pioneering work on explanation. We have three ingredients in causal explanation. This is tripartite structure. We have the cause or causes, so we have certain events that are occurring. We have the laws of nature that give us the dynamics for how the system will evolve forward in time. And then we have the effect. And the laws function to link the cause to the effect. If we didn't have the laws on the table, we'd have no link at all between the cause and the effect. There'd be no route from the striking event to the 10 ball winding up in the corner pocket. Causation isn't the only area in which we see explanation rearing its beautiful head. In logic and mathematics, we also seem to be capable of producing explanatory proofs. Not all proofs are explanatory, but some are. And so we could imagine here's just a very simple modus ponens inference. If A, then B, A, therefore B. So I don't know, if it's raining, then the streets will get wet. It's raining, therefore the streets will get wet. That's the kind of inference that's being exhibited here. If you want to know why B, the conclusion of the argument, follows, we can explain why B follows. B follows from our premises, 1 and 2, if A then B and A, but just as with causation, the conclusion only follows from the premises via links. In this case, the links in logic are not laws of nature. They are what logicians call inference rules, in this case, modus ponens. If we just have the premises, nothing whatsoever follows from the premises. things only follow in a logical system via inference rules. Until we have those on the table, we are not capable of deriving anything at all, and ipso facto, we are not capable of explaining any conclusions whatsoever. So in both the causal and the logical cases, we see a certain kind of characteristic tripartite structure of explanation. We have a certain kind of basis, the cause or the premises, a certain kind of result, the effect or the conclusion, and then we have links that are linking the basis to the result. In the causal case, those were the laws of nature. In the logical case, those were the inference rules. As with causal and logical explanation, so with metaphysical explanation. We'll find, I believe, the exact same pattern holding in this case. So consider the chemical fact that there's an H2O molecule present. And consider the physical fact that is presumably the basis for that chemical fact, or the physical facts plurally, I should say, namely that there's an H atom here, and that there's an H atom there, and that there's an O atom here, and that they're arranged and bonded in the right ways. So when you have these physical facts of these atoms being arranged and bonded in the right ways, that seems to be the basis for the holding of the chemical fact, that we have an H2O molecule present. But though it might seem as if that's all it takes to have an H2O molecule present, you just need the atoms arranged and bonded in the right way. If you think about the pattern that we saw with causation and with logical inferences, you might start to notice that there are certain subtle, what you might think of as metaphysical inference rules that are operating in the background, that are enabling us to say that there's an H2O molecule. For when we listed the physical facts, we only listed the existence of the three atoms. It's a further claim that if we have these three atoms, we have a further thing, a fourth thing, the molecule, that we might think of as something like the fusion or a kind of composite that's formed out of those three things. In fact, as it turns out, no contradiction follows from the supposition that there are no fusions whatsoever. It is consistent, I think crazy, but consistent, to deny that there are any chemicals at all, or any persons, or any tables, or anything other than the smallest particles. So given that it's logically consistent to deny that there's anything other than the smallest particles, it is a further step to say that there's this fourth thing depicted here, namely the molecule that is not any one of the three atoms. Moreover, it's not just the existence of the molecule that's of interest to us. There are features of the molecule. For instance, its atomic weight. It's going to weigh in at roughly 18 daltons. And that fact is explained in terms of the atomic weights of its parts. So it's because each H atom has its atomic weight, and the O atom has its atomic weight. And this is the crucial bit, because at least roughly speaking, masses add, that we know how to compute the mass of the molecule. Roughly speaking, we add the individual masses of the atoms. And that's how we get the mass features for the molecules. But it's not automatically given that masses have to add. In fact, strictly speaking, in relativity, they don't because of the equivalence of energy and mass. There's additional principles needed in going from the individual masses of the parts to any conclusion. It would be logically consistent to say that the parts have their masses, but the whole has no mass whatsoever, or some completely unexpected kind of mass. The fact that mass is additive or near additive is an additional principle that needs to be added. So if we are to explain the existence of the H2O molecule and its nature as having, for instance, a certain mass, we are going to need metaphysical principles that function in this linking sort of way, in the way that laws of nature did with causation, in the way that inference rules did with logic, that are going to be bridges from the more fundamental physical level features of this system, that there's an H, and an O atom arranged and bonded as they are, to the chemical level features of this system, namely that there's an H2O molecule with roughly 18 Dalton's mass. So here's what I've tried to portray for us, that in all three of these cases of explanation, causal, logical, and metaphysical explanation, there is a common tripartite structure of basis, link, and result. In the causal case, it's the cause linked to the effect by the law. In the logical case, the premises linked to the conclusion through the rules. In the metaphysical case, the grounds linked to the derivative through the principles. It's no accident, I want to add, that these cases of explanation just so happen to have the same structure. Because actually I think there just is a general notion of explanation that can crop up when dealing with causation, when dealing with logic, when dealing with metaphysical grounding. We have these general resources for asking why, wondering why, and saying, oh, because of so-and-so. Explanations have a general conceptual role. They have an epistemic role of dispelling our wonderment about the world and giving us a basis for knowing why and understanding why things as they are. They have a common ontological role in terms of showing us the most general patterns by which things behave. And in all of these cases, we're just looking at ways of understanding why the world works that are just cropping up in causal, logical, and metaphysical contexts. So it's no accident, I say, that metaphysical explanation has the same tripartite structure as causal and logical explanation, because in the end, they're all just explanation, and there is simply a tripartite structure to explanation. And here, I'm inspired by some work of the Korean-born but American-based philosopher Jaegwon Kim, who offered a very general conception of explanation that I think is deeply revelatory, where Kim's guiding idea is that what explanation is about, when we want to understand why the world is as it is, what we're ultimately after is tracing pathways of dependence. So to know why something happened is to see what it depended on and why the things that it depended on were in place. And that very general conception of explanation as tracking dependent structure also explains why the causal, the logical, and the metaphysical cases all happen to count as cases of explanation, whereas so few other relations are capable of backing explanation. There's really something very sort of special and magical about the causal, logical, and metaphysical cases. They're among the very few relations that seem capable of backing explanation. And drawing on Kim, I'd like to suggest that the reason why that's so is because in the causal, logical, and metaphysical cases, we are tracking dependencies, causal dependencies, logical dependencies, metaphysical dependencies, and that's what explanation is fundamentally about. It's about tracking dependencies. Good. So, here's where we are. First, I talked about this idea of metaphysics as concerned with questions of what grounds what, and as trying to offer us not merely a laundry list of what exists, but an explanatory account of the structure of reality. Secondly, I suggested that explanation requires a certain kind of tripartite structure. And now we're in a position to give a kind of transcendental argument, if you like, for reality having a certain kind of structure. So now I'm ready to consider the question that I mentioned at the very beginning. What must the world be like for metaphysical explanation to be possible? So I've tried to convince you that metaphysical explanation is possible. Perhaps at the end you'll think, well, maybe that should be rethought. Maybe metaphysical explanation turns out not to be possible. But if it is, and if explanation requires this kind of tripartite structure of basis, link, and result, then we have some kind of clue as to the structure of reality. Reality, in order to host explanations, must host bases and links in order that it can host results to be explained. So this requires thinking of reality as having, as it were, three different components, or being fragmentable into three components: the fundamentals, the metaphysical principles, and the derivatives. So somehow this picture for me evokes a sense of grounding and fundamentality in the weight of the base. So that's why that's on that slide. And what I want to just talk about here is one aspect of the metaphysical project, which is to answer the question of what's fundamental. And as already mentioned, there are several different plausible lines that one might take. I myself prefer a kind of physicalist, materialist view on which what's fundamental is the physical state. And in particular, I prefer a holistic version of that. So I say what's fundamental is the physical state, perhaps ultimately the quantum state of the cosmos as a whole. You might have a physicalist view but not like the holistic picture and think that what's most fundamental are lots of little atoms zipping through space-time or something like that. Or you might like a less physicalist and more dualist conception of what's fundamental and think that what's fundamental to reality is the physical states in addition to certain kinds of minds or spirits or souls or something like that. Or you might even go for an idealist view on which it's actually the spirit side of the ledger that's most fundamental. And the physical and material realm is actually dependent upon that. If you hold a theistic view, that's at least one natural interpretation of at least certain kinds of theistic views, where what's most fundamental would be something like the divine spirit, and everything else would be dependent upon that. So I'm not here trying to, I told you which view I prefer. I prefer this physicalist, holistic view of what's fundamental. I'm not trying to argue for that here, but I'm just trying to explain how these views are classified within metaphysics as views about what's fundamental, and where views about what's fundamental fit within a general conception of metaphysics as an explanatory enterprise. Second ingredient, principles. So the title of my talk was Beyond Fundamentality, because I'm now going to start talking about things that are needed in metaphysics in order to be an explanatory enterprise, beyond that first bit where we said what's fundamental. And the second thing that we need to posit the existence of these linking principles. So these might, for instance, be principles if we think back to the case of the H2O molecule that's built out of the H, and the O atoms. These might be principles, for instance, about when a whole is formed out of its parts. Or if you like a holistic picture, they might also be principles about when parts can be sliced out from their more underlying wholes. There'll also be principles of property inheritance. They'll tell us how to derive, for instance, the chemical, the biological, perhaps the psychological, perhaps the social features of systems from their more fundamental physical bases. So I have a picture of the great Neo-Platonist philosopher Plotinus up here, because it was Plotinus who, in my reading of the history of these matters, draws attention in the clearest way to the role that these principles play. For Plotinus, in fact, there aren't any fundamental entities at all. In my reading, Plotinus would say that when we try to enter what goes into the fundamentals box, there's just nothing that goes in there. Rather, all that's fundamental for Plotinus, as I read him, is the principle of unity. Plotinus says the principle of unity is deeper than any entity, because there can't ever be an entity unless there's already the principle of unity for that entity to be a unified thing, a one. And Plotinus tried to show how from the principle of unity itself, without any fundamental input, you could generate all of reality. And he posed the problem of how is it that any reality at all is generated from the principle of unity. He asks, why doesn't the principle of unity just remain sort of statically there with nothing else emanating from or generated out of it? And here Plotinus invokes these principles of generation. So leaving the details of Plotinus aside, what's relevant here is just that we need these linking principles for metaphysical explanation to be possible. So that's our second ingredient in our metaphysical inquiry, if metaphysical explanation is to be possible. And the third ingredient, of course, are the dependent results. Things like chemical systems and biological systems and tables and chairs and whatnot. Things that aren't fundamental, perhaps numbers, depending on what you think about that case, perhaps minds, depending on what you think about that case. These are the things whose existence and natures will depend upon the fundamentals, ultimately, via the principles. And so all of this together gives a picture that I'm labeling, this is to take a label from Kit Fine, I'll label constructional ontology. So in a constructional ontology, we have the task of the metaphysician is now not as Quine had it. As Quine had it, the task of the metaphysician is simply to say what there is. And that task is simply to identify a single set, the set of existence, just to give a kind of laundry list of what's out there. On a constructional ontology, the task of metaphysics is more articulated. It's to say three separate things. First, the metaphysician is tasked with saying what the fundamentals are. Secondly, the metaphysician is tasked with delivering the principles. And thirdly, the metaphysician is tasked with identifying the derivative features of reality, subject to the constraint that the fundamentals plus the principles be apt for generating the derivatives. This is a bit like what a causal inquiry would look like if we asked first for the initial conditions, say the conditions at the Big Bang or what have you. Those are, as it were, the causally fundamental conditions. Secondly, for the laws of nature, whatever those might be, that drive the world through time. And thirdly, for the conditions of the rest of history, subject to the constraint that the initial conditions and the laws of nature fit the conditions assigned to the rest of history. It's also what a logical inquiry would look like, where we started off with our premises, those take the role of the fundamentals, and our inference rules, those take the role of our principles, and then anything further that we derived, our conclusions, or even intermediate lines in our proof that were derived, subject, of course, to the constraint that the premises plus the inference rules actually do logically entail those conclusions. So, in conclusion, I've tried to offer you a conception of metaphysical inquiry built around the idea that we can explain what the world is like. And that requires us to go beyond the Quinean idea that metaphysics is just about what exists. It also requires us to go beyond the idea of fundamentality and to posit these three separate categories: the fundamentals, the principles, and the derivatives. Thank you very much.